Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome. I think everyone has joined now. They can still come in a little bit later if they want to. Let me introduce myself. I'm Jason Rowland of RDK Group, which is a media consultancy firm based in Vientiane. I'm also involved in a cultural studies series that happens in person here in Vientiane. And as a longtime friend of the Traditional Arts and Ethnology Center, I was asked to moderate this talk as Tara is away, contrary to what you see here in the Zoom list. On behalf of TAEC, I want to thank you all for joining us, particularly those who made a small donation. That really helps TAEC keep these talks free and to support TAEC's ongoing activities. For those of you that may not be familiar with TAEC, it is a cultural heritage social enterprise located in Montreal. They run a museum, craft shops. They also do training and advocacy work, particularly along the lines of cultural and intellectual property rights and the protection of traditional designs. They also do education and outreach activities and continue to conduct research with a particular focus on disseminating anthropological and cultural research on Laos to help make it more accessible to wider audiences around the world, such as this morning's talk. Before we get started, we are recording this session. So a link to the session will be shared by email after the event, and it may also be put on YouTube. During the talk, if you have any questions, please leave them in the chat and we'll get to as many as possible after the presentation. TAEC intends to have further webinars in the future, usually about once every month. And TAEC is on all social media, so you can just follow along and learn about our talks in the future. All right, now to today, we're excited to host Dr. Brian Wolfson-Ford. He is a Southeast Asia reference librarian at the Asia Division of the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. He received his PhD in Southeast Asian history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2018. His research interests include the Lao elite, palm leaf manuscripts, and intellectual and political history. He has also conducted archival research in Laos, Thailand, France, and the United States. So thank you again, Ryan, for agreeing to give this talk. Everyone, please feel free to leave your questions in the chat, and so we'll hand it over to Ryan.
Hello. I'll just share my screen. There we go. So I'm Brian Wolfson-Ford, and this talk is part of a larger work of mine on liberal democracy and anti-communism in Laos from 1945 to 1975. And I should also mention that I am speaking in a private capacity today and not on behalf of the Library of Congress. And I'm going to read a paper, but I'm looking very much forward to the discussion at the end of this session. So this talk presents correspondence between Royal Lao Government Prime Minister Souvanna Phouma and Pathet Lao leader Souphanouvong exchanged at the height of the Second Indochina War in Laos. The letters reveal deteriorating relations between the two men who were half-brothers from a branch of the Luangprabang royal family, while elucidating the deeply rooted nature of the conflict between the Pathet Lao and the Royal Lao Government. They provide an entry point into the reasoning, understanding, conceptions, and mental states of both leaders in vivid detail and the expressive telling language of their own privately exchanged words. This has important bearing on current historical understanding of the Second Indochina War in Laos, which is only beginning to be studied in new ways. The correspondence reveals how emotional the war had become for both men and how they were driven by personal sentiment as much as by rational political stances and realpolitik calculuses. It offers new insight into the US bombing of Laos as well. The research for this talk is based primarily on Souvanna Phouma's personal diaries held at the Library of Congress and secondarily on documents from the US National Archives at College Park, Maryland. The diaries contain nearly 40 letters, mostly telegrams, allowing for an unprecedented behind-the-scenes view into the relations of the two men at a pivotal moment in modern Lao history. Most sources for this period come from either publicly available sources or from foreign non-Lao archives, but these documents constitute a rare, extant, and accessible archive originating from Laos itself. Moreover, after December 1963, the two men were no longer meeting in person. Thus, these letters were the only way to communicate, lending them greater significance. The single most important source for this talk are the diaries of Souvanna Phouma. The diaries themselves are handwritten in French in a small, sometimes messy cursive script. Souvanna evidently used annual day planners to serve as his diary. He used a variety of day planners from Thailand, South Vietnam, France, Russia, and Myanmar. One might imagine he picked them up at the airport before heading off to the next conference, dialogue, negotiation, or official visit. But his use of day planners did pose a problem, as some entries exceeded the allotted space for the day. Most entries are the same, in which he wrote out activities of the day, but some include lengthy records of conversations with high-level people. And parts of his diary were periodically published in the official Royal Lao Government newspaper. The diary's value as a historical source is much more than just preserving Souvanna's private reflections, though. Interspersed in the pages of the diaries, one finds a large number of various annexed documents, from telegrams, correspondence, and letters to internal Royal Lao Government documents and daily military briefings. These documents are invaluable because RLG archival documents are not readily accessible anywhere in the world. Moreover, Souvanna seemed to have saved only those documents which were associated with the most important events. Thus, one can see the origins of the US bombing campaign in the first half of 1964 using Souvanna's diaries. It's an important source for modern Lao history. So what's in the letters? They contain appeals for reviving stalled peace talks. They recount the horrors of the early bombing campaign. They debate the nature of the war and the stances both Souvanna and Souphanouvong took, as well as the legitimacy of each government. But crucially, they include bitter recriminations and personal attacks. One question this talk explores is, to what extent did the emotional state of Souvanna Phouma and Souphanouvong shape the Second Indochina War in Laos? Did ill feelings stirred up by the exchange possibly worsen an already brutal war? This is contrary to historians' portrayal of the two brothers' good family relations, which are claimed to have led to peace talks and the first coalition government in 1957 and again in 1973. Instead, during the bombing campaign, those same familial connections may in fact have worsened the conflict. Both men seem to have hardened their stances to pursue a more brutal war due to the strained relations, as the family connection soured and became a liability driving war, not peace. The key context for this correspondence was the emerging US bombing campaign of Laos, which began on May 21st, 1964, initially as armed reconnaissance, with US pilots flying Royal Lao Army Air Force marked aircraft, and continued until the February 1973 peace accords. But what is not commonly known is that Laos civilian and military leadership opposing the Pathet Lao played a major role in the campaign. Indeed, Souphanouvong accused Souvanna of being personally responsible for ordering the US bombing campaign in a letter written in July 1964, not after it began. As Prime Minister of the Royal Lao Government, Souvanna Phouma not only authorized the US bombing and so was ultimately responsible for it, but he was indispensable to it and shaped key parts of it. He was directly involved in its daily operations, targeting, rules of engagement, area of bombardment, armament, planes, pilots, air bases, logistics, training, planning, and so on. And Souvanna was the one who demanded the whole campaign be done in strict secrecy, even though US officials said this was impossible. Souvanna and the Royal Lao Government leadership believed they had no choice but to appeal to the US to defend their country through a massive, catastrophic bombing campaign. The Royal Lao Government leaders sought to stop an overwhelming North Vietnamese-led invasion threatening to overthrow the government and conquer the country. They fought to defend the liberal democracy they had built since 1945 and to defend a future free from communism. The proximate cause for Souvanna's highly important decision to authorize a US bombing campaign was the devastating Pathet Lao North Vietnamese army advances against the neutralist forces, which had continued unabated since November 1962, and which had nearly swept the neutralist forces from the Plain of Jars by May of 1964. At this point, Souvanna only seems to have finally changed his mind at a dinner party with Western diplomats, including US Ambassador Leonard Unger, on May 19th, 1964. Quote, to their surprise, Souvanna began speaking in stinging terms Pathet Lao betrayal and the losses suffered by neutralist forces on the plain of jars, end of quote. Souvanna was frustrated by the Pathet Lao and the Soviet Union's responses to his protest of these attacks, saying Souphanouvong had flatly denied them, while the USSR ambassador refused to act. Quote, several times Souvanna said it seemed to him that force was all that was left. He became so distraught that he pointedly asked Unger, what was the US waiting for? Why didn't it bomb North Vietnam and China? End quote. At the same time, the US was also evaluating the situation and seeing air power was necessary to support the Royal Lao Army, but that the Royal Lao Air Force was ineffective. President Lyndon Johnson and his advisors wanted to begin US armed reconnaissance missions. Quote, everyone agreed Souvanna's permission was required before such a mission could be flown, end quote. The US bombing of Laos had enormous consequences. The country continues to suffer from the effects of this today, more than 50 years after it began. But most of the public and scholarly community remain unaware of the role of the Royal Lao government in the US bombing campaign. The US could not have undertaken the campaign without explicit approval from the Royal Lao government. There is a memo to this effect dated May 21st, 1964, providing Royal Lao government authorization for the bombing campaign. Souvanna's main concern was the fighting around the Plain of Jars, but when the campaign expanded to interdict the North Vietnamese along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, Souvanna Phouma gave his approval to that as well. As U.S. Ambassador William Sullivan reminded his superiors on March 22, 1965, quote, RLG approval was needed for new programs and for the U.S. to attack new targets. Lao national interests and conditions as interpreted by Souvanna took precedence. On occasion, the U.S. might have to sacrifice military opportunities or temper them to the political climate. Air power in Laos would in every instance have to operate within this framework, end quote. Thus, the Royal Lao government was formally within the chain of authorizations needed for air operations. Souvanna, though, could and did stop the bombing. He had the power to do that, such as when civilians were killed. But when this happened, both he and the King Savang Watana told U.S. ambassadors the campaign must continue. It was too important to stop. When the U.S. mistakenly hit Kang Kai, the main Pathet Lao controlled town, quote, both Souvanna and Unger agreed hitting Kang Kai was regrettable, but they also agreed that the Royal Lao government need not apologize for carrying the war to the Pathet Lao, end quote. Not long after the bombing began, King Savang Watana, quote, told the prime minister in no uncertain terms that the U.S. armed reconnaissance flights must continue, end quote. The Royal Lao government leadership made choices. They had a major role in events that has been neglected by historians, which has distorted our understanding of the Second Indochina War in Laos. Only when we account for the Royal Lao government can we begin to better understand the conflict. Souvanna's greatest influence over the U.S. bombing campaign was his demand that it be done secretly. He forced U.S. officials to lie to the world, even though the evidence for the campaign was glaring. Souvanna agreed to U.S. armed reconnaissance, quote, but vigorously insisted Washington not publicly state it was sending fighters. The less said about all this, the better. It was wiser to adopt the communist tactics of denial, even lying if need be, end quote. Ambassador Sullivan complained to Washington that Souvanna forced him to, quote, behave just like the DRV ambassador and deny it all, end quote. Indeed, it got to the point that when journalists asked President Johnson in January 1965 about news reports of US bombings in Laos, that even he had to lie, quote, the president would only comment that it was public knowledge that the United States was helping the Royal Laotian government defend itself, end quote. Souvanna's demand for secrecy was motivated partly by his desire to maintain his image as a Lao neutralist leader, which was a point he and Souphanouvong bitterly argued about in their correspondence. But he also likely took inspiration from North Vietnam, which had been intervening on Lao territory with impunity while denying it for well over a decade. It appears Souvanna may well have thought it was time the Royal Lao government did the same and fought fire with fire. When reading telegram exchanges with U.S. ambassadors about the bombing campaign, Souvanna Phouma was always concerned not to hit Kang Kai and Siang Quang, which was the principal Pathet Lao city. In short, it was off limits. But when it was accidentally hit by U.S. planes, Souvanna demanded a damage report. One can see now Souvanna must have feared harming Souphanouvong, who was there on the ground. In fact, Souphanouvong's house in Kang Kai was bombed not long after the U.S. bombing campaign began. The exchange of letters preserved in Souvanna's diaries contain unique information about both men not available from other sources, but it also preserves a harrowing story of two half-brothers on opposite sides in a brutal war. Western scholars and US officials at the time both claimed Souvanna Phouma was soft on communism because of his family ties to Souphanouvong. Yet I argue the same tie likely worsened relations during the US bombing campaign. Summing up this notion, Martin Stewart Fox writes in his widely cited A History of Laos about, quote, a belief that he, Souvanna, could always come to an acceptable agreement with his half-brother, Souphanouvong, whom he refused to think of as a communist, end quote. Michael Field, a journalist at the time who had met with Souvanna, wrote this, quote, in this, he, Souvanna, had a unique advantage, since Prince Souphanouvong was his half-brother. From so close a relative, he expected and received preferential treatment, end quote. But even Royal Lao Army generals like Suchai Vongsavan, charged with operations in southern Laos along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, felt Souvanna was soft on his half-brother, quote, because he trusted his younger half-brother, Prince Souphanouvong, the leader of the Pathet Lao, and considered him to be an honorable member of their royal family, he, Souvanna Phouma, had no great fear of the Pathet Lao, end quote. Yet this theory of relations does not hold for the 1960s, especially after 1962. Whatever family relations between the two men was progressively destroyed in the course of the war. As the largest bombing campaign in history per capita unfolded, the letters exchanged between Souvanna and Souphanouvong could no longer smooth things over. Thus, I argue the fraternal link actually worsened rather than ameliorated the conflict. It is possible to see the squabbling among the brothers, each entrenched in his own personal beliefs, prolonged or worsened the war. The major points discussed in these letters were how to restore peace, who the neutralist leader was, what the nature of the conflict was, as well as what the practical on-the-ground realities were, and what the essential political stances of each man were. But the discussion was anything but peaceful and harmonious. It became quite heated and acrimonious as personal accusations were made. The fundamental issues in question remained unsolvable due to the deep nature of the disagreements. Both men espoused the values associated with the 1962 Geneva Accords, peace, neutrality, independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. But these same values meant different things to each one as they were interpreted and applied differently. This basic conflict was only finally resolved on the battlefield as negotiations and nearly all forms of communication, aside from these few letters and telegrams, broke down or ceased, stilled to silence by the raging war engulfing the country. Even the letters themselves appear to have ceased from 1968 to 1970. One of the most pressing issues discussed was how to restore peace. Souphanouvong repeatedly sought to hold talks with Souvanna Phouma. His letter of December 3rd, 1964, lamented how various forces kept the two men from talking. He wrote of how they had tried to negotiate in Paris in September but failed, as he noted that the dispute over where to hold meetings in Laos, quote, interrupted negotiations for a long time, end quote. Much of the letter by Souphanouvong blames Souvanna for failing to negotiate. Souphanouvong derived from this that Souvanna was not neutral, inasmuch as Souvanna was pursuing war and not peace, and that it was only thanks to the Neo Lao Haksat, as Souphanouvong called his movement, and not the Pathet Lao, as they are commonly known, that negotiations happened, and whatever success they had was due to the Neo Lao Haksat. An important context Souphanouvong did not mention, but Souvanna Phouma later wrote about in the correspondence, was the frequent small-scale nibbling attacks the Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese undertook from July of 1962 to May of 1964, that in Souvanna's eyes repeatedly violated the 1962 Geneva Accords and made the Second Coalition government's functioning impossible. Souphanouvong accused Souvanna of not wanting to talk. Commenting on Souvanna's decision to not return to Paris, Souphanouvong wrote, quote, this is the truth. It clearly shows who is motivated by goodwill, who is not, who wants to negotiate, who does not, end quote. Souphanouvong wrote separately to King Savang Watana in a letter dated February 8, 1965, calling for the U.S. to stop intervening in Laos and, quote, let the Laos settle their own affairs, end quote. And in a letter of May 10, 1965 to Souvanna Phouma, Souphanouvong wrote that it was the Neo Lao Haksat who followed the agreements. The Lao right wing, by which he meant the Royal Lao Government, did not, which is ultimately what had led to the war. In his December 3rd, 1964 letter, Souphanouvong claimed that the Neo Lao Haksat were the peacemakers while the US and the Royal Lao Government made war. Quote, although American imperialists and their lackeys are torpedoing negotiations, unleashing furious military attacks, the Neo Lao Haksat nevertheless resolutely maintains its position of settling all problems by means of peaceful negotiations, end quote. Despite all the recriminations, Souphanouvong was really intent on reviving talks containing serious proposals. To that end, he appealed to Souvanna Phouma in a way that must have carried weight in the past, writing, quote, apart from this peaceful and negotiated solution, there is no other, end quote. There are not as many letters from Souvanna Phouma that he saved in his diaries, but one of the few letters he kept was from March 15, 1965. In this letter, he wrote to Souphanouvong requesting an immediate ceasefire as a necessary prerequisite to talks. Quote, I renew to you my urgent appeal for a general, sincere, and controlled ceasefire between the three Lao armed forces, end quote. He noted that there were many violations of the 1962 Geneva Accords by the Pathet Lao and the, quote, Viet Minh, by which he meant the North Vietnamese army, recalling attacks against neutralist forces in 1962 and 1963. Quote, the responsibility for these repeated violations of the agreement lies entirely with the Lao Haksat, end quote. However, in the same letter, Souvanna did offer to resume talks in Vientiane, even offering the International Control Commission to provide security for Souphanouvong. Souvanna then added, quote, our position therefore remains in complete harmony with the principles of the 1962 agreements and internal agreements, end quote. A shorter letter from February 26, 1965 was even more emphatic. Souvanna wrote that conditions were good for a ceasefire and one must be agreed and immediately implemented because, quote, Indo-Chinese events could at any time become extremely dangerous, end quote. He called on Souphanouvong to agree to a tripartite ceasefire, which he said would lead to talks in Vientiane. He spoke of practical, frank solutions, quote, I am making this proposal to you, asking you to consider it with the greatest attention, regardless of any idea other than that of arriving at a concrete solution, end quote. Yet the very question of peace led to arguments over who was a true neutralist leader, Souvanna or Souphanouvong. Various passages from the correspondence trace this. In one letter, Souphanouvong signed his name as the leader of the, quote, authentic neutralist forces. Responding to this in a letter dated September 7th, 1964, Souvanna Phouma wrote to Souphanouvong saying, quote, you know that my quality as the leader of the neutralist party does not give me any competence in the administration of the right party, as I have none in your own party either. It would be a big mistake on your part to believe that through my position as Prime Minister and Minister of National Defense, I have become the leader of the right party. I am and remain a neutralist. I defend the interests and aspirations of all those who seek the happiness and prosperity of Laos and neutrality, independence, and sovereignty. I therefore categorically reject the appellation of, quote, authentic neutralist forces that you claim to apply to the elements that you have managed to mislead by unfair maneuvers, end quote. This passage also shows how correspondence was shaped by emotion, signaling a time of growing strain in the two men's relationship. Further, Souphanouvong always referred to himself as a prince, even when writing in Lao. The latter issue was shown in a letter Souphanouvong wrote to King Sabang Watana of February 8, 1965. It is noteworthy that Souphanouvong, who had already been so concerned about proper titles in letters to Souvanna, then addressed the king as, quote, His Majesty the King. If the Lao Haksat was going to institute socialism and overthrow the monarchy, then why did Souphanouvong not challenge the king's title? Souphanouvong instead addressed the king as sire, and toward the end of the letter, he used language approaching Lao Rasasap to plead with the king, implying respect for the institution of the monarchy. Quote, I would allow myself once more to request your majesty to deign to use his high prestige to help find measures likely to oppose the disastrous aims of aggression of the American imperialists and the acts of national treason of their lackeys with a view to pull our dear fatherland and our beloved people out of the state of misery and mourning in which they currently find themselves, end quote. He implored the king, quote, I hope that your majesty will deign to use his august influence over Souvanna Phouma and other Royal Lao Government officials. Souphanouvong never addressed why he referred to both Souvanna and himself as prince in both French and Lao, nor why he referred to the king as he did while actively pursuing a socialist revolution. Some of the most important and harrowing evidence preserved in the letters are early accounts by Souphanouvong of the devastation the US bombing campaign was causing. Less than 2 months after it commenced, Souphanouvong wrote Souvanna a letter from January 19, 1964, saying the US and the Royal Lao Government had, quote, totally destroyed the government of national unity, shattered the Geneva Accords, and sent American planes daily to bomb, machine gun, and spray toxic chemicals in order to massacre the Lao population, end quote. He continued that the US and the Royal Lao Government, quote, want to start a full-scale war, end quote. And Souphanouvong added that if the US bombing continued, it would earn the Pathet Lao the sympathy of the population due to the collateral damage and the many innocent civilians caught up in the bombing. 6 months later, in a letter dated December 3rd, 1964, Souphanouvong noted the extent of the damage caused by the US bombing. Quote, these large-scale attacks on areas under Lao Haksak control have caused serious loss of life and property to our people. According to provisional figures, hundreds of civilians have been killed or injured, hundreds of residential houses, public buildings, and temples have been destroyed, countless numbers of buffaloes, oxen, pigs, and crops have been lost to the planes, guns, and tanks of the US imperialists and the right wing, end quote. Separately, Souphanouvong wrote to the king on February 8th, 1965, about the devastation caused by the bombing. He said one of the causes of the escalation was the, quote, destructive raids by American planes against our peaceful population, end quote. Thus, he appealed for peace, quote, the American imperialists and their lackeys must immediately cease all attacks and all air raids against areas under the Lao Haksak control, end quote. Likewise, in a letter from Souphanouvong to Souvanna from May 10th, 1965, Souphanouvong wrote that in order to hold talks, Souvanna must end the US bombing, quote, and more particularly put an immediate end to all air raids, end quote. The text here was underlined by Souphanouvong himself in the original. Souphanouvong bore witness to the death and destruction unleashed by the campaign in a letter from March 6, 1965, writing, quote, the US have not ceased to send their planes taking off from their bases in South Vietnam and Thailand and from the 7th Fleet to dump, together with the planes of the right-wing party in Laos, tens of thousands of tons of bombs on many villages, localities, and roads in our liberated areas, causing countless damage in human lives and property to our compatriots, end quote. And in a letter from April 1st, 1966, Souphanouvong spoke of, quote, intense day and night bombardment and strafing raids on all sectors of the liberated zone, including the spraying of toxic chemicals, killing many innocent civilians, destroying temples, schools, hospitals, and fields with the most revolting barbarity, end quote. One key facet of the correspondence were the passages detailing how emotionally charged both men were due to the war. One example came in a letter Souphanouvong wrote to Souvanna dated July 19, 1964. After denying Souvanna's charges about North Vietnamese involvement in a Pathet Lao offensive, Souphanouvong wrote, quote, I want you to know that if it was really the Lao Haksak that harbored intentions of launching a large-scale offensive to gain ground and completely annihilate your forces as claimed by the slanders of the United States and the Lao right, the capture of Long Soi, Bang Bien, or other places would not be difficult. It would not require anyone's help, end quote. Souphanouvong added his frustration that the Pathet Lao had repeatedly proposed peace negotiations without success. Souvanna underlined this with a question mark. He also added additional places then threatened by the Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese army forces. Souphanouvong became emotionally upset again in a letter dated December 3rd, 1964, about the breakdown in negotiations, quote, why didn't you dare recall the truth of the facts as I have just related them? To say that I softened your mind and kept you waiting, etc. It's clear you deliberately turned things around, coldly distorting the truth to fool public opinion and blame others, end quote. One way Souphanouvong incited Souvanna was by personally accusing him of being responsible for the US bombing, the war, and the breakdown in peace talks. In a letter from July 19, 1964, he wrote, quote, I have very certain information that you have given your consent to the US bombing campaign. In all this, you are their accomplice, and you have contributed to making the situation in Laos more serious than ever. However, you, who are a man able to think, instead of preventing them by all possible means, you have, on the contrary, shared their feelings and approved in one way or another of their actions. The Lao people cannot forgive you for this, end quote. Souphanouvong's writing was emotionally charged on this point. He accused Souvanna of ordering the murder, even massacre, of the Lao people, He closed the letter by personally appealing to Souvanna to end the bombing. Quote, "I hope that upon receipt of this message, you will reflect well and take measures to prevent the launching by the U.S. and its agents of the adventurous and dangerous operations of which I have just spoken. In case you are not able to prevent it, try by all means to save yourself from their grip, so that in no case can they use your personal name for the realization of their policy of aggression and treason." End quote. Souphanouvong ended with a threat for Souvanna that the U.S. would, quote, "get rid of you," end quote, like other U.S. Cold War clients in Southeast Asia, conjuring the fate of the recently assassinated Ngo Dinh Diem in South Vietnam. He repeated a similar threat in a letter from March 6, 1965, quote, "If you persist in following the old rut, harboring the illusion of support of the Americans and the right-wing party, opposing your people and not desiring national harmony and unification, you will not be able to escape the fate reserved for the rotten lackeys of the Americans, nor the responsibility for the very harmful consequences for our country and for yourself," end quote. Souphanouvong was not above using emotional manipulation from incitement to threats to influence Souvanna. More broadly, the correspondence is a witness to the raw emotions experienced by the two leaders as the country was engulfed in the largest war in Lao history. Both men were flawed human beings, controlled by passions no different than anyone else in history. But this evidence of emotion adds a much needed human dimension to historical accounts of the Second Indochina War in Laos. Did Souvanna fight more brutally against the Pathet Lao because of his ire raised in letters such as this? Were the factors leading to peace in 1957 now a liability that drove the two men to a destructive death drive of reprisals and revenge? It is difficult to point to concrete examples, but in terms of the US bombing campaign, Souvanna and other Royal Lao Government leaders did seem to become desensitized to violence over time. One wonders too if the violence unleashed against the Royal Lao Government officials during the revolution of 1975 by the Pathet Lao was driven to greater excess by such experiences during the war. The letters Souphanouvong and Souvanna exchanged were also a chance to state one's positions. The restricted nature of the correspondence, in which each only had a few pages at most to state their views, led to statements that were essentialized, boiled down to their utmost basic forms. Souphanouvong suggested this in a letter from March 25, 1965, when he wrote that due to the inherent limitations of telegrams, quote, "I am limiting myself to defining my point of view on a certain number of essential points," end quote. Thus, in a letter of December 3rd, 1964, Souphanouvong denied that North Vietnam had intervened in Laos. Quote, "It is only to cover and hide the interference and aggression of the American imperialists, the fact in itself having no basis," end quote. Likewise, in a letter of April 1st, 1966, he wrote, "North Vietnam, quote, has always proved in words as in deeds its respect and correct observance of the 1962 Geneva Accords. It strictly respected the sovereignty, independence, peace, and neutrality of Laos." This political rhetoric highlighted sharply different views, but also worsened communication and inflamed tensions between the two men. Souphanouvong's letters were full of rhetoric of, quote, "American imperialists and their lackeys," end quote. He frequently reduced the Royal Lao Government to the Lao right wing, which was inevitably doomed to serve as a lackey of the US, and even called Souvanna Phouma a US mouthpiece. Thus, in a letter from December 3rd, 1964, Souphanouvong wrote Souvanna to, quote, "no longer allow the American imperialists and the right to use you as an instrument in the service of the foreign aggressors against patriotic and peace-loving forces and personalities," end quote. And in another letter from May 10th, 1965, quote, "for more than 2 years, the American imperialists and the right-wing party have endeavored to make you their mouthpiece to distort the truth, shamelessly slander the position, points of view, and goodwill of the Nea Lao Haksat, and to slander even the DRV, our neighbor who has always supported the just struggle of our people," end quote. Souphanouvong repeated such claims in his letter of February 8th, 1965 to the king, writing, quote, "the American imperialists have used Souvanna Phouma as their mouthpiece," end quote, and accused Souvanna of being one of the, quote, "servants of the Americans in Laos," end quote. These statements not only show the substantial disagreements between the two men, but how communication broke down through deeply personal attacks and recriminations. One of the most serious breakdowns in communications came when Souphanouvong accused the Royal Lao Government of not being a legitimate government. The ultimate statement of this was when Souphanouvong railed against attempts by Souvanna, the king, and others to revive the National Assembly, amend the Constitution, and begin to hold elections again. In a May 10, 1965 letter, Souphanouvong wrote, "The right-wing party and you yourself, obeying American orders, have played and continue to play the comedy of the so-called constitutional measures by daring to push His Majesty the King to convene the so-called National Congress, which should approve certain amendments to the Constitution intended to allow the establishment of a new National Assembly and a new government." Souvanna Phouma or Souphanouvong implied all of this actions were illegitimate. He condemned it as perfidy to invite the Lao Haksat to participate. Quote, "I reaffirm here the vanity and uselessness of these ridiculous maneuvers and actions of the Americans and their lackeys, because however treacherous they may be, they cannot deceive anyone, but will be vigorously denounced and condemned by national and international opinion." End quote. He was particularly upset that the Royal Lao Government had ruled that the Lao Haksat was, quote, "a rebel in opposition to the Constitution against the sovereign," end quote. To him, the sole legitimate government was the tripartite government. Quote, "For this government of national unity alone constitutes the legal government of the Lao people. It alone is authorized to decide on all the important affairs of the nation, including the question of general elections," end quote. He continued, quote, "As for the present authorities in Vientiane, which the Lao Haksat considers to be illegal and 100% instrument in service of the aggressor American imperialists, they have no capacity to represent the Lao people, and therefore they have no right to take it upon themselves to organize elections or a popular consultation or anything similar," end quote. To Souphanouvong, it was all null and void as well as illegal. Similarly, in a letter to Souvanna dated March 6, 1965, Souphanouvong wrote, feeling threatened by the revival of liberal democracy, dismissed it as a puppet. Quote, "If you persist at the behest of the Americans and of the right in giving birth through some political artifice to any puppet administration, you can be sure that the Lao people will only be able to consider it as an instrument at the service of the Americans to torpedo our country, leaving it without any value, and they will oppose it until the end," end quote. Finally, in a letter from November 8, 1966, Souphanouvong called on Souvanna to cancel the upcoming election scheduled for January 1st, 1967, calling them, quote, "entirely illegal, divisive, and reactionary," end quote. Souphanouvong feared the revival of liberal democracy in the Royal Lao Government area because it would undoubtedly add much needed legitimacy while also clearly offering something the Pathet Lao zone did not have. For his part, in a letter of March 15, 1965, Souvanna countered that Souphanouvong could rejoin the cabinet if he was willing to come to Vientiane, while implying that the Royal Lao Government could not be paralyzed by absent ministers. Regarding elections and the new constitution, Souvanna wrote, quote, "The latest ministerial changes are constitutional. They are approved by the National Assembly and by the highest authority of our country, by His Majesty the King himself, the supreme guardian of our national constitution. No international agreement and no agreement between Lao can claim any supremacy." Souvanna Phouma saved his own letters far less often than he saved Souphanouvong's. Yet he did from time to time save some of them. His letter from February 18th, 1966 is a good example of a clear statement of his own stance boiled down to the essential aspects due to the limitations of the exchange via telegrams. He wrote firstly that the war must be solved by an internal solution. Quote, "We agree on only one point. The Lao problem must be solved by the Lao themselves," end quote. He added that his own ideas were not from foreign countries. Quote, "It is always by virtue of this principle that I have acted during my political career, and now more than ever, without seeking ideological and dogmatic inspirations in other countries near or far," end quote. But he then turned to embrace the stridently nationalist idea of a Lao race then in vogue to explain his rejection not only of foreign influence, but of communism specifically. Quote, "We Lao were born on a very old land. We have an admirable religion revered by millions of human beings, a culture that is in many respects satisfactory. This is enough for me to believe that we can progress without destroying all these values in the name of the so-called historical determinism, end quote. Next, Souvanna wrote that the Royal Lao government was already independent and did not need to be liberated by the Pathet Lao or North Vietnam, quote. Our fight was over. We were independent, end quote. But he noted the source of the conflict was the Pathet Lao refusal to acknowledge Lao independence, quote. The Neo Lao Haksat went on its way with foreigners, communists, to lead a communist revolution on the pretext of incomplete national independence, end quote. Souvanna accused the Pathet Lao of being foreign and killing Lao, quote. To achieve this end, the Neo Lao Haksat did not hesitate to tolerate foreign troops treading on our soil, fighting with their own troops, killing and massacring in at least 3 provinces, brave Lao peasants who have never seen an American imperialist in their lives and have never even heard of either Marx or Lenin, end quote. Souvanna condemned the Pathet Lao for never separating from North Vietnam, quote, because it is its only chance not to die politically, end quote. Thus, Souvanna said the Pathet Lao was a foreign organization, quote. The Neo Lao Haksat has no basis in the Lao people. It is a foreign body. We saw this clearly when the provinces of Sam Nua and Pong Sali were liberated from the communist yoke. The Neo Lao Haksat can therefore only exist and act if it has foreign troops at its side. Without them, the revolution dies like a lamp without oil, end quote. Souvanna urged his brother to break with North Vietnam, writing, quote, let it abandon its masters and its inspirations. Let it become a strictly nationalist Lao party. Send home the North Vietnamese soldiers and peace will flourish in Laos, end quote. He accused the Pathet Lao of owing its existence to foreign power, end quote. The Neo Lao Haksat has become a very obedient lackey itself, end quote. To Souvanna, the war was a defensive war for the Royal Lao Government, where as soon as the Royal Lao Government defended itself, the Pathet Lao, quote, accuses it of aggression, end quote. But Souvanna accused the Pathet Lao of hypocrisy, quote. The Neo Lao Haksat on its part advances, takes ground together with its North Vietnamese accomplices. This is what it calls liberating territories, end quote. This letter is the one letter in the entire collection which seems to show Souvanna losing his temper. He writes, quote, all these tactics which we have seen you practicing in our country for 20 years as the ABC of the communist revolutionary, it no longer deceives anyone. The Neo Lao Haksat applies it, however, with method and stubbornness as it has learned it. The messages, the grandiloquent protests to His Majesty, to the people, to the Prime Minister, to the co-presidents of the ICC, etc., proceed from this education where you, your allies, draw your strength and your weakness, because nothing is less inevitable than your victory. Millions of men live happily under non-communist regimes, end quote. Souvanna ended the letter by saying, quote, if you really want to act as a Lao patriot, start with your friends by respecting the 1962 Accords. Let's govern together in a government that exists. Let's give the International Commission all the freedoms and all the means to really control the execution of the 1962 agreements, end quote. He added, quote, I expect a clear answer from you on this subject and not fanciful accusations and a historical account on an issue where, as an eyewitness to the North Vietnamese army presence in Laos, I can easily destroy all of your arguments on independence and the unwavering patriotism of the Neo Lao Haksat, end quote. The breakdown in communication here was due to emotional outbursts, but it was also caused by the essentially irreconcilable stances each man took. This could only be settled on the battlefield. Finally, one may note there appears to be a 2-year gap in the correspondence from March of 1968 to April of 1970, where there are no communications between the two men. Souvanna's diaries are not a perfect record, but are suggestive of a breakdown in communication during these years. Already in an April 1, 1966 letter, Souphanouvong suggested the communication via letters was losing its efficacy as he complained of having to repeat his positions, quote, because you persist in not wanting to understand them, end quote. Similarly, in a letter of February 24th, 1966, Souphanouvong wrote, quote, relations between us have currently shown an undesirable tension, end quote. Finally, in a letter from May 13th, 1967, Souphanouvong attacked Souvanna Phouma on a number of issues, possibly sealing the rift. He opened on a conciliatory note, quote, although our relations have visibly deteriorated, I have nonetheless sent you letters and telegrams regularly, especially in these serious and fraught hours of danger for our dear fatherland. My only aim each time has always been to discuss thoroughly and frankly these and other questions in the hope that, conscious of the dangers to our country, you would think of yourselves of reducing your activities perjurical to the nation and to the Lao people, since the enemy left you the nominal title of Prime Minister of the puppet regime, end quote. But now, long after his brother might be dissuaded from authorizing the US bombing, Souphanouvong no longer blamed Souvanna for the bombing. This marked a major shift from his letter of July 19th, 1964, where he personally accused Souvanna of ordering the bombing. Now, Souphanouvong claimed that Souvanna was nothing more than a US puppet, which was the most powerful rhetorical attack he had. Quote, remember that 3 years ago, when you resorted to the same kind of slander by your request, in fact, it was the demand of your Yank masters, you gave the green light to their open and brazen air attacks against our population, against our villages, temples, schools, hospitals, and markets, thus allowing them to accumulate ruins and mournings without number with a relentlessness and increasing scale every day, end quote. Souphanouvong was incensed at Souvanna's continued accusations against North Vietnam. Quote, you have not ceased, especially during the last 2 months, to distort the truth and forge lies to denigrate the Lao Lao Hoc Sat and slander the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, end quote. Souphanouvong instead praised the DRV, quote, the Vietnamese people and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam have always helped us in our struggle against the colonial and imperialist aggressors for the conquest and safeguarding of our national independence. Can't you see that they are universally admired for their incredibly heroic and glorious struggle against the Yankee imperialists? End quote. Souphanouvong accused Souvanna, quote, you have confused your enemies and your friends, end quote. Finally, Souphanouvong expressed great fear of the introduction of US troops, which he had mentioned in earlier letters in sharp terms. The introduction in Laos of GIs and their satellites which will trample the land of our ancestors and cause greater calamities to the nation, end quote. Souphanouvong even expressed fears of extinction as the war escalated, quote. Everyone at home and around the world knows perfectly well that the US imperialists are the savage aggressors of Laos, that they are perpetrating in Vietnam a war of extermination even more bloodthirsty than the Nazis, end quote. Given the strongly worded letter, it was difficult to keep the lines of communication open between the two men. Souvanna Phouma did not save as many of his own letters, so it may be that he also contributed to the breakdown in communication. Miraculously, relations between the two men were not permanently damaged. Souvanna Phouma again negotiated a third coalition government after the February 21st, 1973 peace accord. His critics, many from within the Royal Lao Government, again felt he was too soft on the Pathet Lao, but he now had the US support to reach a rapid agreement. He stayed in country after 1975 and did not flee the country like many other Royal Lao Government officials. Neither was he placed under house arrest or sent to re-education camps like most of the other Royal Lao Government civilian and military leadership who stayed, including even the royal family. This set the stage for his relations with Souphanouvong to recover over time. Souphanouvong's son told Christopher Kremer that Souphanouvong and Souvanna Phouma continued to debate politics until the ends of their lives. He recalled, or quote, he recalled the two old men, his father and his uncle, arguing to the end about politics as the patrician Souvanna Phouma taught his communist half-brother to play bridge. The Red Prince was still present at the time, but having suffered a stroke on his way to a non-aligned settlement in 1983, his strength too was failing, end quote. The son added that Souphanouvong reminisced in the last days of his life, not on the victory of 1975, but the Isara days when he fought alongside Souvanna Phouma. Souphanouvong finally died on January 9th, 1995 of a heart attack. One wonders if he had grown lonely over the 11 years after Souvanna Phouma died in October 1984. Thank you.